I stood by the fireplace, lipstick half applied, the clink of wine glasses echoing through my own house. Laughter spilled from the parlor where the guests gathered. My guests, as I searched the vanity for something that should never have been gone. My dentures. Gone. Hidden. And across the room, Vanessa leaned in, whispering, "She'll keep her mouth shut tonight." She meant it as a joke, but after raising her husband, funding their life, and opening my home, they silenced me like a nuisance, like furniture that had overstayed its welcome. Before we start the story, tell me where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to subscribe. It wasn't the dentures. It was the humiliation in her eyes. The mirror didn't lie. Margaret Lewis leaned in close, silver curls pinned just so, pearls sitting high on her collarbone, and a naked space where her smile used to be. She opened the velvet case on her vanity again, though she'd checked it twice already. Empty. No dentures. Not on the tray. Not under the sink. Not even in the drawer where she kept the backup set she hadn't worn in 5 years. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 6 p.m. Guests would arrive within the hour. The annual Lewis family spring gala, a tradition that once belonged to Margaret and her late husband, now paraded around like a social climbing tool by the woman who married her only son. And that woman had just robbed her of her dignity. From the hallway, Margaret heard the swish of chiffon and sharp giggles. She didn't need to open the door to know it was Vanessa. "I swear," Vanessa whispered to someone, one of her overgroomed brunch friends, no doubt. "She'll keep her mouth shut tonight, I guarantee it." Laughter followed, high-pitched, mean, imitation sweet. Margaret's fingers tightened around the vanity edge. She closed the denture case slowly, deliberately. Then she stood up, straightened her spine, and walked to the closet. If Vanessa thought silence was surrender, she'd forgotten who taught Daniel to read. By the time guests arrived, Margaret was seated near the grand piano wearing her best navy gown. She smiled with her eyes, nodded politely, but said nothing. When introduced, she gave a gentle wave. When praised, she simply bowed her head. Her lips stayed closed. Vanessa played hostess in the center of it all. Arms draped in silk, diamond earrings dancing, charm turned up to 10. She made sure every camera caught her, every socialite hugged her, and every compliment circled back to her name. At the champagne toast, Daniel tapped his glass, standing awkwardly beside his wife. "To my mother," he said, "who built this home with my father's legacy and withstood so much." He turned to her. "Mom, say a few words?" Murmurs of support rippled through the crowd. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it. Vanessa tilted her head, feigning surprise. "She's feeling shy tonight." More laughter. Someone chuckled. "First time for everything." Margaret simply raised her glass. A silent salute. But inside, something had shifted. The burn of humiliation had scorched deeper than ever before, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. And the person who'd orchestrated it knew exactly what she was doing. Vanessa floated through the rest of the evening like a queen. She whispered just loud enough for others to hear. "She's sweet, but slipping. I told Daniel she's not really hosting anymore, just attending." Margaret heard it. She heard all of it. She simply smiled with her eyes, clasped her hands in her lap, and let Vanessa believe she'd won. By the time the last guest had left and the caterers were packing up, Margaret had already retired upstairs. She waited until the house went quiet, until even Vanessa's heels stopped clicking on the marble, before opening her walk-in closet. Behind a row of pressed cardigans, she reached for a lockbox, a safe, disguised as a faux jewelry trunk. She spun the dial. The latch clicked open. Inside, wrapped in a layer of felt and silence, sat a single manila envelope. She slid it out. Across the top, the word deed stamped in bold. Margaret sat down at the vanity, unsealing the envelope with careful fingers. The legal document inside was pristine, still crisp, still active. The deed to the estate, her estate, still in her name, still under her control, still unseen by Vanessa. She traced the signature at the bottom with her thumb. Then calmly, without ceremony, she closed the envelope, returned it to the safe, and relocked it. Before switching off the light, Margaret glanced at the empty denture case one last time. A slow smile tugged at the corners of her lips, gums and all. "Let's see how well you chew when the tables turn," she whispered, and the room fell into silence, but not submission, just strategy. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Margaret's study, dappling her oak desk in soft gold. The room smelled of old books, leather-bound law journals, and the faint citrus polish Clara had always recommended. Margaret sat alone with the deed spread in front of her. A single sheet of paper, yet heavier than any weapon she could ever hold. She adjusted her glasses and read slowly, deliberately. The clauses hadn't changed. The ownership remained squarely in her name. No automatic transfer, no stipulations promising it to Daniel, or worse, to Vanessa. She could pass the estate to whomever she wished, or no one at all. The silence in the room was thick, not heavy, but full of power. A silence that knew something others didn't. She picked up the phone. "Did she actually hide your dentures?" Clara's voice crackled over the line like firewood snapping. "She did," Margaret replied calmly, tracing her finger down the margin of the deed. "And she laughed? Like she won something." The other end, Clara exhaled. Sharp, lawyer-like. "Then let's take everything back." They met that afternoon at Clara's home, a neat Georgian on the edge of town, filled with mahogany furniture, tax codes, and bourbon that only came out for war. Clara spread the document across the kitchen table, red pen in hand, glasses low on her nose. "Well, sweetheart, you can legally redirect ownership through a trust. Entirely within your right." Margaret nodded, unsmiling. "Without needing Daniel's consent?" "Correct. The estate was never jointly owned. It was transferred to you after Harold passed." Margaret folded her hands. "Then she thinks wrong." Clara leaned back, her eyes sharp. "But understand, Maggie, this isn't just about teaching her a lesson. Once this is done, it's legacy. Set in stone. No undoing it later for the sake of peace or guilt." "I'm not angry," Margaret said quietly. "I'm focused." That night, back at the mansion, Margaret returned the deed to its safe. The papers were crisp from recent handling, but still untouched in the legal sense. The lock clicked shut. She didn't feel triumph. Not yet. But there was something colder, deeper, brewing in her chest. A readiness. Over the next few days, Margaret moved like a ghost through her own home, polite, silent, waiting. She watched Vanessa flit from room to room, barking orders at decorators, swiping through Pinterest boards on her iPad. She caught her one morning in the sunroom, talking to a friend on speaker. "Oh, once this house is ours, I'm gutting that awful green bathroom." Margaret still thinks bidets are European luxury. "Please. This place needs a facelift," Margaret passed through with a tea tray, smiling softly. "Would you like lemon, dear?" Vanessa blinked, momentarily off balance. "Oh, sure," Margaret poured. She said nothing, and that silence, that stillness, unsettled Vanessa more than any lecture ever could. At dinner the next evening, Vanessa raised her wineglass. To the future, and to inheriting more than just furniture. Laughter rippled among the guests. Daniel chuckled weakly. Margaret simply folded her napkin in half, then in half again. She wasn't ready to strike yet. A flame too eager goes out early. Let her keep gloating. Let her toast. let her stand on the very floorboards she thought she owned, because Margaret knew the truth. She'd already begun the quiet work of erasing Vanessa from the future. Later that night, as guests lingered in the parlor with brandy and gossip, Margaret overheard Vanessa near the fireplace, laughing with another couple. "Oh, once this house is ours, we'll throw real parties. Maybe even tear down that old study. It's so outdated," the fire cracked behind her. Margaret stood near the doorway, invisible but listening. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. They thought they were planning their future, but Margaret was already rewriting it, in ink that couldn't be washed away. There's a special kind of arrogance that comes not from confidence, but assumption. Vanessa wore that arrogance like a tailored blazer. She stood in the sunroom on a Thursday morning, barefoot, holding a swatch book in one manicured hand and a cappuccino in the other. Her silk robe clung to her like a magazine spread. The swatches fluttered as she turned toward Daniel, who sat on the edge of the sofa, half listening. "I'm thinking something fresh for this room. Maybe a warm linen or eggshell if we want to keep it neutral. This whole house screams old Dallas." Daniel nodded, barely looking up from his tablet. "Sure. Whatever makes you happy." Margaret stood silently in the doorway, a book tucked under her arm. She wasn't eavesdropping. Not really. The conversation was offered freely, because they no longer saw her as someone worth whispering around. That was their first mistake. Later that day, she passed by the kitchen and overheard Vanessa speaking on the phone. "Yes, of course. Once the house is ours officially, we'll redo the entryway. The front doors feel tired. We're thinking double-pane glass with matte brass handles. It'll really open up the foyer hours. When?" The entitlement hung in the air like cheap perfume. Margaret didn't interrupt. She simply picked a fresh lemon from the bowl and sliced it slowly for her tea, letting the citrus mist coat her fingers as Vanessa's voice faded behind her. By that weekend, Vanessa had set up a Pinterest board titled "Our Forever Estate" and was actively gathering quotes for a kitchen remodel. "I want a farmhouse sink," she told Daniel. "It'll modernize the whole vibe. And your mom can keep her little antique tea nook." For now, Margaret sipped her Darjeeling across the table and smiled softly. "How thoughtful of you." Vanessa didn't even hear the sarcasm. She was too busy scrolling through backsplash options. Meanwhile, in a quiet office across town, Clara clicked her pen and pushed the revised paperwork across her desk. "All right," she said, looking Margaret directly in the eye. "Everything is legally sound. The estate trust has been amended. It'll transfer upon your passing exactly as you requested. And not to Vanessa." Margaret signed her name without hesitation. The pen barely lifted off the page. Back at home, the performance continued. Vanessa left architectural sketches on the dining room table, new lighting plans, mood boards, fabric samples. She walked through the halls making measurements and snapping photos for before and afters. Daniel followed her like a tired shadow, too weary to question her confidence. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't warn. She didn't correct. She let the fantasy grow. Because the deeper Vanessa sank into expectation, the harder the ground would feel when it fell out from under her. Clara made sure everything was watertight. Airtight clauses, hidden contingencies, protected trusts. The house, the land, the legacy. All rerouted through channels Vanessa couldn't even see, let alone reach. No one outside Clara and Margaret knew a thing, and that was precisely how Margaret wanted it. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the family's longtime estate attorney sent out formal invitations. Embossed, cream-colored envelopes sealed in wax. Inside, "You are cordially invited to the official reading of the Lewis family will, scheduled for next month." Vanessa squealed when hers arrived. She waved it in front of Daniel like a lottery ticket. "Oh, finally," she beamed. "We can officially start planning." Margaret, across the room, opened her envelope without a word. She tucked it into a drawer, then returned to her needlepoint without looking up. The final act had already begun. They just didn't know they were in it. The champagne bubbled, the string quartet hummed in the corner, and the scent of expensive lilies filled the grand hall like perfume with a superiority complex. Vanessa moved through the room like a hostess on a lifestyle show, all teeth and curated laughter. Her heels clicked across the marble like punctuation marks to her own importance. Margaret stood at the edge of the staircase, wrapped in a deep burgundy shawl, watching her daughter-in-law perform. The guests, friends, neighbors, socialites from the club, were too polite to comment, but the undercurrent of forced perfection was unmistakable. This wasn't a party, it was a stage, and Vanessa was dying for an audience. "Oh, Margaret!" Vanessa chirped as she floated over, clutching a crystal flute and flashing a blinding smile. "Isn't this just so much better than last year? I added gold leaf on the centerpieces. Just a little touch of elevation." Margaret tilted her head. "It's ambitious?" The gold distracts from the wilted hydrangeas. Vanessa's smile flickered. "Only slightly. Just enough to satisfy." "Always so honest." Vanessa laughed tightly, leaning in. "But really, it's about building a legacy, don't you think?" Margaret took a long sip of her tea. "Legacy builds itself when you're worth remembering." Throughout the evening, Vanessa preened for attention. She told stories that didn't belong to her. She bragged about the mansion's bones, as if she'd laid the foundation herself. She called Daniel over for photo ops, laughing loudly whenever Margaret passed by, her voice rising like she was trying to drown something out. But Margaret never broke rhythm. She moved through the room with practiced grace, offering soft greetings and calm smiles. She asked about a neighbor's grandchild, complimented another's brooch, and shared an old recipe with one of the caterers. The conversations were small, but sincere, and guests noticed. They saw the contrast. They always do. At one point, Vanessa stood in a cluster of women from the club, waving her hand as if conducting their laughter. "Of course, once we take over the property officially, we'll probably host a real charity gala. Something meaningful." Margaret's always had such quaint ideas. The group glanced toward the far end of the room, where Margaret stood beneath the chandelier, speaking softly with the mayor's wife. She wasn't looking back, and somehow, that stung more. Later, as the party began to wind down and the music softened into background ambiance, Vanessa approached Margaret once again. "You've been quiet tonight," she said, swirling the last of her champagne. "I hope you're not feeling left behind." Margaret offered a warm smile, the kind that said absolutely nothing and everything all at once. "Oh no, dear," she said sweetly. "Sometimes the best view is from the edge of the room." Vanessa blinked. Margaret turned away before she could respond, her shawl brushing Vanessa's arm like a curtain falling on the final act. As Margaret stepped onto the back veranda for air, Clara approached, holding a glass of ginger ale and wearing that familiar look, part smug, part reverent. "I saw the way she was circling you," Clara muttered, lips barely moving. "She wants applause," Margaret said, "but I'm not her audience." "You'll like this then." Clara handed her a folded document. Margaret opened it. At the top, embossed in gold, "Confirmation of trust transfer, executed and sealed." She exhaled slowly. Not relief, satisfaction. "It's done," Clara said softly. "Everything is signed. The deed is untouchable now." Inside, Vanessa raised a toast with the last of the guests. "To family," she said proudly, "and to building something truly lasting." Margaret watched through the window, her fingers resting lightly on the document in her hands. Let her toast. Let her dream. Because the foundation Vanessa was standing on had already shifted beneath her heels. Some victories are loud, others live quietly in vaults, whispered only between ink and paper. Margaret sat across from Clara in the old law office, the scent of aged leather and pine-scented polish lingering in the air. The document between them was thick, notarized, bound, final. Clara tapped the page once with her pen. All it needs is your signature. Margaret adjusted her glasses and slowly pressed her name into the page. Her handwriting was deliberate. Not shaky, not rushed, but steady, unmistakable. As she dotted the final I in her surname, a current of calm settled through her bones. That's it, Clara said, sealing the folder. The deed's officially under the Lewis family trust. Controlled exclusively by you until the time comes. Vanessa has no legal claim. Not now. Not ever. Margaret didn't grin. She simply exhaled, as if letting go of weight no one else saw. Back at the estate, Vanessa stood by the breakfast bar sipping from a green juice bottle, her voice high-pitched with theatrical concern. Margaret, you really should think about letting go of all this stress. You're getting older. It can't be good for your heart, handling all these property decisions. Margaret stirred her tea. Is that your medical opinion, dear? Vanessa gave a tight laugh and looked at Daniel, who sat thumbing through emails on his phone. I'm just saying, you've done enough. Let the younger generation step in. We've got big dreams for this place. Daniel nodded vaguely. Maybe someday. Margaret didn't argue, she didn't flinch. She simply sipped, let the lemon peel kiss her tongue, and said, Someday comes faster than people think. Later in the garden, Vanessa found her moment to strike again. As Margaret tended to the hydrangeas, clipping browning petals into a wicker basket, Vanessa lingered beside her with a smug little smirk. You know, she said, swirling the ice in her glass of cucumber water. You're kind of like these plants now. Delicate, ornamental. Past your prime, but everyone's too polite to say it. Margaret smiled, tucking another bloom into the basket. Funny, she replied. I was just thinking how some flowers look beautiful, right before they rot. Vanessa blinked, unsure whether it was an insult or a compliment. Margaret didn't clarify. She didn't need to. That evening, Margaret returned to her study. She placed the signed documents into the fireproof safe behind her father's old portrait, the one no one ever bothered to look behind. She ran a finger across the top of the safe, then lit a sandalwood candle nearby. Clara had been right. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. I wish I could see her face, Clara said later that week, swirling her wine on Margaret's veranda. Oh, you will? Margaret replied, reclining comfortably beneath the awning. The reading's been scheduled. She'll be wearing pearls and that smug little smirk. And when the truth lands, she raised her tea. I imagine she'll need something stronger than juice. Clara clinked glasses with her. She'll choke on this one day. Margaret smiled faintly. That's the plan. 2 days later, a cream-colored envelope with gold filigree landed on the marble kitchen counter. Vanessa squealed when she saw the wax seal. She tore it open and gasped. It's happening, she shouted. The will reading is set. Finally, finally. She waved the invitation in front of Daniel's face, dancing barefoot across the polished floor. This is it. This house. This life. It's officially ours. Margaret looked up from her crossword puzzle, blinked slowly, and smiled. Vanessa was celebrating the coronation, unaware the crown was already locked away, and she'd never touch it. The dining room gleamed like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Gold-rimmed plates, fresh eucalyptus woven through tall candlesticks, napkins folded into swans. But underneath the elegance, Margaret could smell the desperation. Vanessa had outdone herself. Again. This time for Daniel's 40th birthday, a milestone she turned into a declaration of territory. Margaret sat at the end of the long oak table, her fingers lightly brushing the etched glass stem of her water goblet. The linen napkin on her lap was embroidered with a cursive L, as if Vanessa had already stamped her initials into the estate. She hadn't said a word. Not yet. She didn't need to. To Daniel! Vanessa chirped from the opposite end of the table, her voice brighter than the chandelier's glow. And to the future we're building. Here, together, in this beautiful home. A chorus of polite claps followed, glasses raised high. One of Daniel's friends chuckled. So, when are the renovations starting? Vanessa leaned in, grinning like a queen addressing her court. Well, after the will is officially read, of course. But I've already picked out some paint swatches. Grage for the parlor. Something timeless. Margaret sipped her tea. Jasmine tonight. Soft, floral, perfectly steeped. Oh? She said, voice feather-light. I thought timeless things didn't need repainting. The table quieted for a breath too long. Vanessa laughed, forced, brittle. Well, tastes evolve. We're just updating, not erasing. Of course, Margaret murmured, returning to her tea. That's what termites do too. They update from the inside. Throughout the meal, Vanessa played her part like a socialite on a reality show. She bragged about the house's potential, spoke of future galas, and referred to the master suite as our wing. Her tone dripped with ownership, but her eyes occasionally flicked toward Margaret, as if daring her to object. Margaret never did. She just watched, and it was far more unsettling than protest. Guests shifted uncomfortably between bites of roasted duck and heirloom carrots. The more Vanessa staked her imaginary claim, the more obvious it became. The woman of the house was not the woman at the head of the table. Margaret didn't need to host. She just had to exist. As dessert was served, a 3-tiered lemon chiffon cake that tasted more ambition than flavor, Margaret leaned toward one of the older guests seated beside her. Do you know what makes a house a home? She asked quietly. The woman shook her head politely. Margaret smiled, knowing who really owns the keys. Dinner ended with more speeches from Vanessa and a painfully awkward attempt at a toast from Daniel. He raised his glass and said, "To family, and to the legacy we're lucky to continue." Lucky, Margaret thought, not earned, just expected. As guests moved into the sitting room, she excused herself, making her way toward the study to collect a book she'd left earlier. The hallway smelled faintly of rosewood and candle smoke, warm and familiar. But as she turned the corner, she stopped. The door to her study was cracked open, and through the narrow slit, she caught a flash of blonde hair, delicate fingers rifling through drawers, the glint of a phone flashlight bouncing off lacquered wood. Vanessa. Margaret didn't speak. Not yet. She watched in silence just long enough to see Vanessa pause, look up, and panic. The game had shifted. Now Vanessa wasn't hosting. She was hunting. And Margaret? She was already 2 moves ahead. The creak of the study door wasn't loud, but it was enough. Margaret paused in the hallway, one hand still on the banister. The sounds inside were soft, deliberate. The hush of drawers opening, the whisper of pages being shuffled, like someone handling treasure with sticky fingers. She didn't need to look. She already knew. Vanessa stood in the center of the study, her posture tense, her movements surgical. The moonlight through the tall windows cast jagged shadows over her face as she rifled through the bottom drawer of Margaret's antique writing desk. She'd started with the obvious, the mahogany chest near the fireplace, the locked drawer in the end table. Now she was going for the desk, the one that still smelled faintly of ink and lavender oil. Inside, only decoys, old recipe clippings, letters from long-dead friends, a church newsletter from 2003. Vanessa hissed under her breath. Where was it? The deed. The will. Whatever Margaret was hiding. Margaret leaned quietly against the hallway wall, just beyond the doorframe. The scent of the room drifted to her, parchment, and aged wood. Her study had always been a place of peace, not war. But tonight it was a battlefield, and her opponent was swinging blindly. She let Vanessa search another few seconds, let her squirm. Then, calmly, she stepped inside. "I hope you're finding the evening enlightening." Vanessa froze. Her hand still clutched a stack of church donation receipts as she turned slowly to face Margaret. "Oh, Margaret, I I was just looking for more candles. The dining room ones burned down." Margaret tilted her head slightly. Her eyes were unreadable, but not unkind. "In my desk drawers?" she asked softly. "Or in my tax files from 1999? Vanessa flushed. She looked down at the papers in her hands, realizing her mistake. She dropped them quickly, and they fluttered to the carpet like feathers from a broken pillow. "I thought maybe you kept storage lists here." "For decor." "Of course," Margaret nodded slowly, walking further into the room. "Because I always store candelabras under documents from my late husband's estate planning." Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. The room fell into an elegant silence, the kind that makes the air taste heavy. Margaret bent gracefully, gathering the dropped pages. "You know," she said, placing each sheet neatly back in place. "It's easy to open a drawer. A little harder to understand what you're looking at." Vanessa stood awkwardly near the fireplace, eyes scanning for escape. "I didn't mean—" Margaret looked up. "Careful, dear. Some things bite back when you dig too deep." The words weren't threatening. They were instructional. Like a mother telling a child not to stick a hand in a wasp's nest. Vanessa stiffened, unsure how to respond. The power dynamic had shifted, and she knew it. Margaret's calm was no longer weakness. It was strategy. Control wrapped in silk. "Go on," Margaret said, nodding gently toward the hallway. "I believe they're serving dessert." Vanessa hesitated, then nodded and quickly brushed past her. As she reached the door, a voice floated in from the living room. "Clara called," Daniel was saying cheerfully. "She's dropping off the finalized documents tomorrow. Said Mom signed everything already." Vanessa stopped dead. "Clara. Documents. Signed." She turned back toward the study, but Margaret was already blowing out the candle beside the bookcase, the shadows swallowing her expression. Vanessa's smile dropped completely. The paper she wanted might not even be here anymore. She stood there a second longer, hand still gripping the frame of the door. If Clara was involved, this wasn't just about keeping secrets. This was legal. Locked. Final. And Vanessa, for the first time, felt the ground beneath her start to shift. The storm didn't arrive with thunder. It walked in wearing stilettos and a half-finished smile. Margaret was arranging roses in a crystal vase on the sunroom table when Vanessa entered without knocking. Her heels clicked across the marble floor like accusations. "You and Clara are up to something," Vanessa said flatly, arms crossed. Her voice was too calm to be casual. "I heard Daniel talking about documents. Legal ones." Margaret didn't flinch. She carefully trimmed a stem with silver shears, then dropped the blossom into the water. "Clara?" she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "You'll have to be more specific." "I've known several Claras in my life. One ran a bridge club. Another was my dentist's wife." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Don't play dumb." "Your lawyer friend, the one who used to handle estate work." Daniel said she was here. Last week, Margaret raised an eyebrow, expression mild. "Ah, that Clara. Lovely woman. We talk often?" Vanessa stepped forward, her perfume thick with tension. "Are you changing your will?" There it was. The mask off. Finally. Margaret placed the pruning shears down. The roses were done. So was the game of pretending. "I'm sorry, dear. Is something worrying you?" Vanessa's nostrils flared. "Don't patronize me. You've been quiet. Sneaky. And now Clara's involved. And Daniel said something about finalized documents. If you're making changes, I deserve to know. Margaret's tone didn't shift an inch. Deserve is such a slippery word, Vanessa. It rarely means what people think it means. From the hallway, footsteps approached. Daniel, holding his phone and a lukewarm cup of coffee. Everything okay? He asked, sensing the temperature in the room before he entered it. She's avoiding the question, Vanessa snapped. Ask your mother what she and Clara have been doing. Daniel sighed. Vanessa, please. Ask her. Margaret looked at her son, eyes gentle. Darling, have I ever made a decision without careful thought? Daniel hesitated. No, Mom. Vanessa turned to him, frustrated. She's manipulating everything. Behind our backs, Daniel's voice dropped. Or she's protecting her wishes. She's allowed to talk to a lawyer. She hasn't even said she changed anything? Margaret smiled faintly. Exactly. The silence stretched. The weight shifted. Vanessa's shoulders stiffened. Her voice lowered. This house was supposed to be ours. Margaret folded her hands in front of her. Ah, supposed to be Vanessa's. Face reddened. Her hands curled at her sides. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out, the door swinging behind her like a final breath. Margaret watched her go with the air of someone watching a teacup crack in slow motion. Daniel lingered, eyes heavy with conflict. You two need to talk. Oh, we just did, Margaret said gently. She just didn't hear anything. He left too, quietly, as if escaping an emotional spill. A moment later, Clara appeared at the edge of the hallway, having just arrived from the side entrance. You heard all that? Margaret asked, sipping her now cool tea. Clara smirked. She's predictable. And panicked. The worst combination. She suspects something, Margaret said. Clara nodded. Let her. She's not prepared for what's coming. Margaret looked down at the tea leaves settling in her cup. She knows nothing. Clara handed over a thick white envelope. Speaking of what's coming, the official will reading invitation just went out. Margaret's eyes sparkled. She didn't need to say a word. Vanessa's countdown had officially begun. The silence inside the law office was stiff. The kind of silence that creaks under the weight of expectation. Mahogany walls gleamed under dim yellow lights, and the long rectangular conference table stretched like a runway for humiliation. Vanessa walked in first, heels sharp, Chanel suit pristine, her hand tightly clasping Daniel's. Her confidence was armor. Let's get this over with, she said under her breath, scanning the room like it already belonged to her. Margaret arrived second, slowly, elegantly, in a navy silk blouse and pearl earrings, her silver hair pinned with quiet precision. She gave a slight nod to the receptionist, then to the lawyer seated at the head of the table. Clara walked in behind her, not saying a word, just offering a brief glance toward Vanessa, the kind of glance that could slice porcelain. The lawyer cleared his throat. If we're ready to begin, he said, adjusting his glasses and flipping open a thick file marked Lewis Estate in gold letters. We'll read the last will and testament of Margaret Eleanor Lewis, notarized and witnessed 2 weeks ago. Vanessa leaned back, smug. 2 weeks ago? She whispered. How cute. She thinks a last-minute rewrite can scare me. Daniel looked down. Something in his chest pulled tight, but he said nothing. The lawyer began. I, Margaret Eleanor Lewis, being of sound mind, do hereby declare this document to be my final will. All personal items, family jewelry, heirlooms, letters, are to be passed to my son, Daniel Thomas Lewis. Daniel blinked. That was expected. However, the family estate, 1,124 Camden Row, including its land, titles, and assets, is to be transferred in full to the Eleanor Legacy Foundation, a charitable trust established in my name, managed by appointed trustees, for community and educational advancement. The room froze. Vanessa's jaw dropped, not subtly, not slowly, but with the kind of disbelief that made her fingers slowly unlace from Daniel's hand. "I'm sorry, what?" she said aloud, laughing dryly. "Is this a joke?" The lawyer didn't blink. "Mrs. Lewis retains the legal right to designate property into a trust, as she did prior to the signing of this will. Vanessa Claire Lewis," he continued, voice even, "receives no inheritance, monetary or otherwise, from this estate, per clause 14.3, which reserves distribution only for those whom the decedent felt demonstrated honor, discretion, and loyalty to the family legacy." Vanessa's skin flushed red. "You can't be serious," she hissed, standing suddenly. "This house is ours. Daniel, say something." Daniel looked at his mother. Margaret's eyes never left Vanessa. "I didn't know," he said softly. "You're not actually letting this happen, are you?" Vanessa barked, now nearly trembling. "She's senile. She's being manipulated." "Sit down," Margaret said. Not loudly, not cruelly, but with the weight of finality. The same way a gavel ends a trial. The lawyer closed the folder. "The transfer into the Eleanor Legacy Foundation has already been finalized and recorded. The trust is now irrevocable. This concludes." The reading silence followed. Vanessa stood there, breath uneven, her composure cracked clean through. The other guests, two distant cousins, a family friend, and Clara, looked anywhere but at her. The room shifted away from her like oil pushed from water. Clara leaned in toward Margaret. "Beautifully done," she whispered. Margaret stood slowly, walked over to Vanessa, and without breaking her serene smile, she leaned just close enough and whispered, "Your mistake wasn't hiding my dentures, darling. It was thinking I had no teeth." Then, as Vanessa's mouth opened in stunned silence, Margaret stepped back. She looked her dead in the eye and winked. Vanessa didn't blink, didn't speak, didn't breathe. Her future, the estate, the power, the illusion, had just been burned to the ground, and Margaret lit the match in pearls. The fallout didn't erupt in fire, it spread in whispers. Soft, scandalized murmurs that rippled through Dallas like perfume and poison. By morning, the entire charity brunch circuit knew what had happened at the will reading. Margaret hadn't just cut Vanessa out. She had done it with grace, with legal elegance, with a smile that left no room for rebuttal. And Vanessa? She didn't show her face for weeks. Her absence from the country club luncheons, from the foundation meetings she once chaired with a glass of rosé in hand, was louder than any tantrum. Her name became a cautionary tale passed over scones and teacups. "Did you hear about Vanessa Lewis?" She thought the mansion was hers. Apparently, Margaret rewrote the whole thing. And that trust? Untouchable. Margaret, meanwhile, wore calm like silk. At a garden fundraiser just days later, she appeared in a pale lilac suit, a diamond brooch on her collar, and a serene expression that made her glow brighter than the lanterns strung above the patio. Clara stood beside her, sipping elderflower lemonade. "You've officially become legend," she murmured, eyes scanning the admiring glances. Margaret smiled. "They always underestimate the quiet ones." The host offered her the seat of honor. 2 women kissed her cheek. 3 more asked for her estate planner's name. No one asked where Vanessa was. Back at home, the silence inside the mansion was thick. Daniel stood in the kitchen one evening, nervously stirring his tea. "She's not taking it well," he said, without looking up. Margaret folded the linen napkins at the counter, her hands practiced, controlled. "Neither did Marie Antoinette," she said lightly. "But history moves on." Daniel hesitated. "She's still my wife, Mom." "She was your wife when she laughed about hiding my dentures," Margaret replied, voice cool but not cruel. "And she was your wife when she tried to rob you blind? He didn't argue, just nodded slowly and left the room with his tea growing cold in his hands. Upstairs, in the master bedroom she once fantasized about remodeling, Vanessa curled up on the chaise lounge she hadn't earned. She scrolled through her phone. No new invites, no lunch plans. Her name, once dripping in curated wealth and social grace, had become a ghost. When she dared post a filtered brunch selfie, no one commented. Not even Karen from the tennis club. The silence screamed louder than any hate. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Her lips curled. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Margaret had embarrassed her in front of everyone. She wasn't just going to sit here and rot in irrelevance. Not without a fight. Downstairs, Clara reclined in Margaret's study, legs crossed, a tumbler of scotch in hand. "She'll lash out," Clara said flatly, the way a seasoned general predicts the next move in battle. "She won't go quietly." "I know," Margaret replied, reaching for the brass letter opener on her desk. "That's why I've prepared the next act." The two women shared a knowing glance. Decades of friendship forged in quiet wars, PTA boardrooms, and now high-stakes legacy. Margaret walked to the window, pulling aside the curtain slightly. Outside, the garden lights flickered as dusk kissed the sky. "She thinks she's cornered," Margaret said. "Cornered people are predictable." "But Vanessa? She's arrogant. That makes her reckless." Upstairs, Vanessa opened her laptop, her fingers moving quickly across the keys. A search bar. A name. Clara Johnson. Estate law. She clicked. And clicked again. Then she smiled. But revenge, like a poorly lit fuse, has a way of blowing up in the wrong hands. The morning sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting a golden hue across the kitchen. Daniel sat at the breakfast table, a half-eaten croissant in front of him, the silence between bites heavier than butter. Across from him, Vanessa leaned in, her tone syrupy and her smile surgical. "She can't do this forever, Danny. You're her only child. The estate, this family, was always meant to be yours." He sighed, eyes fixed on the marble countertop. "It's done, Vanessa." "She's manipulating you," Vanessa snapped, dropping the fake sweetness. "That trust? That foundation? It's her way of freezing me out." Daniel stood, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "You froze yourself out when you started treating her like a pawn. She's still my mother," Vanessa's lip curled. "Then act like her son." The invitation arrived later that week. Hand-delivered, embossed, scented faintly with lavender. "You are cordially invited to the inaugural dinner of the Eleanor Legacy Foundation, hosted by Mrs. Margaret Lewis. Formal attire, charitable guests only." Vanessa read it 3 times. "Is she serious?" she muttered, holding the card like it might bite. "She's naming the trust after herself now?" Daniel, glancing up from his newspaper, nodded slowly. "Yeah. She's serious." Vanessa almost tore the card in half, but didn't. Her mind was already turning. She would go. In heels, in diamonds, with her chin held higher than truth. And she'd make sure everyone knew exactly who Margaret Lewis really was. The ballroom at the Worthington Hotel sparkled like a promise. Gold-plated cutlery, live strings, champagne towers that shimmered under crystal chandeliers. But none of it outshone Margaret. She floated through the room in a deep emerald gown, her silver hair swept into a chignon, her brooch the shape of a phoenix. Clara flanked her like a bodyguard in pearls. Guests whispered praise. "She's never looked more radiant. This new foundation, such vision, she's turned her grief into something truly beautiful." Vanessa arrived late, on purpose. Her dress clung like a warning, blood red and backless, her smile sharp enough to slice crystal. She walked in holding Daniel's arm, but he looked uncomfortable in her grasp. At dinner, Vanessa waited. Watched. She interrupted one guest's praise of Margaret's charitable work with a laugh, just loud enough to draw attention. "Let's not forget," she said, raising her wine glass, "how recently this house was full of family disagreements. But hey, nothing like charity to distract from inheritance drama, right?" The table went quiet. Margaret didn't flinch. She merely reached for her water, sipped, and then, without looking at Vanessa, tapped her glass for attention. "I want to thank everyone for being here," she began, her voice steady and warm, "as we celebrate not just the beginning of a foundation, but the protection of legacy. The Eleanor Legacy Trust is built to support education, home restoration, and women's advancement across the state." Polite applause followed. Margaret smiled, but her eyes moved, straight to Vanessa. "And unlike some inheritances, this one is sealed. Irrevocable. Not subject to familial pressure or manipulation." Vanessa's jaw twitched. Margaret continued, "This house, our estate, has already been transferred into the trust, managed by a third-party board. My son will remain on the advisory panel." Vanessa blinked. "Wait. What?" "Which means," Margaret added lightly, "that no individual, spouse or otherwise, can lay claim to any portion." Clara leaned in and murmured to the guest beside her, just loudly enough, "Flawless execution." After dinner, Vanessa slipped out onto the balcony, barely holding it together. She stared out at the city skyline, fists clenched around the rail. She had walked into this evening thinking she might embarrass Margaret, diminish her, reclaim control. Instead, she'd walked into a press-covered, donor-filled fortress, one she couldn't touch, rewrite, or threaten. Margaret had handed her legacy to the public like a shield, locking it in charity and law. The trap had snapped shut. She had shown up to draw blood. Instead, she bled credibility, influence, and access. The first sign was silence. Vanessa refreshed her group chat twice. No replies. No, "Count me in." No, "You're glowing queen." Not even a pity heart. The brunch invite she'd sent for Saturday. Artisanal garden seating, floral dress code, her favorite rosé, had gone unanswered. She told herself it was coincidence. Labor Day weekend. People busy. But as she scrolled Instagram, her throat tightened. There they were. Karen, Elise, Shannon, sipping mimosas without her, tagged at the new rooftop bistro downtown. No caption, just, "Fresh starts with my girls." No Vanessa. Margaret, meanwhile, entered the tea room at Ify Crescent Hall to light applause. "Margaret, over here." "Darling, that speech you gave last week." "I heard the mayor's wife reached out personally." She moved gracefully through the sea of white linens and silver spoons, shaking hands, kissing cheeks. The air around her wasn't just one of wealth, it was reverence. Her emerald earrings glinted, but her expression stayed warm and light. Not proud, not smug, just quietly untouchable. Clara, trailing beside her like a diplomat with good shoes, leaned in. "She's completely iced out now." Margaret nodded once, not even turning her head. "Told you." Crowns are heavy. Plastic ones break first. Vanessa had never felt invisible before. At boutique openings, she used to command the room with a look. Now, conversations dropped when she walked by. Women who used to beg for party invites now passed her at the club without eye contact. She approached Elise at Pilates. "Hey, I saw your story," she said casually, dabbing sweat from her brow. Elise blinked. "Oh, yeah, super last minute." Then she smiled politely and walked off. Vanessa stared after her, heart hammering. She didn't just lose friends. She lost currency. One evening, Daniel came home early and found Margaret in the garden, trimming roses. He stood awkwardly behind her, hands stuffed in his pockets. She's been having a hard time," he mumbled. Margaret didn't pause. Being held accountable usually is. Daniel exhaled. I just wanted to say thank you for not dragging me into all of it. Margaret clipped a thorny stem and turned. I didn't protect you from her, Daniel. I protected you for yourself. He nodded, the words landing harder than he expected. Margaret smiled softly and returned to her roses. Meanwhile, Clara reviewed the last of the documents in Margaret's office. Every safeguard's in place. Even if she tried to sneak something through Daniel, the board would block it. Good, Margaret replied, pouring 2 glasses of bourbon. She never understood chess. Always played like it was checkers. She handed Clara a glass and held hers up. To distance, legal and personal. They clinked. Clara smirked. Think she'll try again? Margaret tilted her head. She's run out of allies, lawyers, and charm. All that's left is desperation across town. In the guest room she now used as an office, Vanessa stared at a blank screen. She had thought she could social climb her way back into power. That enough diamonds, enough curated photos, enough passive-aggressive charm would undo the damage. She was wrong. But if charm wouldn't work, maybe fear would. She opened a new browser tab. Her fingers hovered for a beat. Then she began typing. Anonymous tip. Foundation financial misconduct. The courtroom echoed with the hollow tap of Vanessa's heels. Her attorney, a fast-talking man with perfectly gelled hair and a leather briefcase full of bluff, assured her this was strategy, a pressure play. But all Vanessa could think about was the smug look on Margaret's face the night of the charity gala. She hadn't slept in 2 nights. Not really. Her makeup hid the fatigue, but not the desperation coiled in her gut. They sat on the claimant's side, poised like royalty forced into battle. On the other side, Margaret sat calmly, wearing dove gray. No lawyer, just Clara at her side, quietly reviewing a bound folder of documents. The judge looked over his glasses. We've reviewed the submitted claims regarding fraudulent foundation activity. Let the record show the court finds no merit for further proceedings. Vanessa flinched. Margaret didn't move. The judge continued. The trust was established in full accordance with Texas nonprofit law. Oversight committee is independent. There is no evidence of self-dealing or malfeasance. Case dismissed. The gavel hit. The room cracked in half. Outside, the steps of the courthouse were stone cold, though the sun beat down like judgment. Reporters had gathered. Not many, just enough to make a scene feel real. Vanessa lowered her sunglasses, brushing past them as they called her name. Mrs. Lewis, do you have a comment? Was this a personal vendetta gone too far? Will you appeal? She didn't answer. Couldn't. Behind her, Margaret exited slowly, a small, unreadable smile curling at the corners of her mouth. Did you enjoy the performance? Clara asked her, dry as a martini. Margaret didn't reply. She didn't need to. Back home, Vanessa tore through her kitchen like a tornado. Wine glass shattered on the floor. Papers flung from the island to the tiles. She kicked the cabinet and screamed into the sink. Daniel stood silently in the doorway. You humiliated us, she spat, not looking at him. No, he said quietly. You humiliated yourself. She froze. His voice was calm but colder than she'd ever heard it. You think people didn't notice? The gala, the lawsuit, the way you twist every moment into a show. She turned, ready to snap, but he raised a hand. I'm done defending this. You went to war with my mother over control, and you lost. It's over. Her breath caught. Are you leaving me? He didn't answer. Not yet. The rumors moved faster than truth. Friends whispered it over cocktails. Did you hear she tried to sue her own mother-in-law? At brunch tables. Apparently the court shut her down cold. Even at the gym. He's probably filing soon. I heard from the paralegal at Barker and Haynes. Vanessa's phone lit up with fewer messages. more notifications from gossip sites than contacts. Her once curated image had collapsed under the weight of her ambition. And Margaret? She was hosting an afternoon poetry reading on the East Terrace. Light hors d'oeuvres, soft jazz. Daniel helped set up chairs. 3 days later, a delivery box arrived for Vanessa. No return label. No note. She sliced it open on the counter, still in her robe, pulled back the tissue paper, and froze. Inside sat her mother-in-law's dentures, pristine, polished, resting in a velvet-lined case like some dark family heirloom. And beneath them, a small gold-embossed card with 5 simple words, "I never forget my smile." Her knees buckled. The room seemed to tilt as rage, shame, and something dangerously close to awe washed over her. It wasn't just a message. It was a monument, a reminder that Margaret hadn't just won. She'd built her revenge on ceremony. She hadn't retaliated. She'd reigned. The box sat unopened on the side table for a full day. Then 2. Vanessa stared at it like it might explode, as if opening it meant surrendering to everything she'd fought so hard to control. But eventually, the weight of silence crushed her curiosity. The tissue paper peeled back with a whisper, and there they were, framed now. The dentures, perfectly centered under glass, mounted like a relic in a black velvet shadow box. A small brass plate at the bottom simply read, "For the smile she tried to erase." No one saw the scream. No one saw the tears. Only the shattered sound of a perfume bottle exploding against the marble floor, and the echo of her own fury bouncing off cold, unlistening walls. Daniel left the next morning. He didn't pack loudly, no slamming drawers or theatrical pauses. Just a suitcase zipped, a few shirts folded, a long look at the wedding photo on the dresser. "Where are you going?" Vanessa asked, her voice fraying at the edges. He didn't answer right away. Just looked at her. Really looked at her. Like a stranger he used to recognize. "I'm going to stay with Mom for a while." Vanessa blinked. "You're taking her side after everything?" He tilted his head, almost amused. She didn't lie. She didn't manipulate. She didn't pretend to love people while planning their funeral. The door clicked shut behind him like punctuation. Meanwhile, Margaret hosted another tea. This one was smaller. A garden setting, linen tablecloths, soft harp music under the crepe myrtle trees, and a signature lemon rosemary tart that made the neighbors rave. Margaret moved through her guests with the ease of someone who'd never once felt out of place in her own home. The study door remained closed, but those closest to her knew what was inside. The framed dentures sat on her bookshelf like a trophy, nestled between first editions and legal journals. No one ever asked about them aloud. They didn't need to. Clara arrived late, holding a bottle of champagne instead of her usual elderflower wine. She leaned in as she kissed Margaret's cheek. "To justice," she said, raising her glass, "with polish." Margaret clinked hers gently. "And plaque protection." They both laughed. Not loud, not cruel. Just satisfied. Vanessa stopped appearing anywhere. No brunches, no charity boards. Her once vibrant Instagram went quiet, then vanished altogether. Her name became a whisper. Not the kind people chase, but the kind they tuck away out of polite embarrassment. People who used to orbit her began skipping her name on guest lists. Even those who had nodded and smiled in her direction for years suddenly forgot to extend invites. Her face didn't just disappear from rooms. It was erased, replaced by Margaret's. The matriarch who had once been underestimated now stood taller than any of them. Her legacy was no longer just a matter of blood. It was reputation, precision, power measured in smiles and sealed documents. One evening, alone in her now half-empty condo, Vanessa opened a bottle of wine and stared at the wall. Her reflection in the window showed her the truth. The woman who thought she could outwit time Outplay age and outmaneuver legacy had been outlived. Not in years, but in relevance. There were no texts, no calls, just shadows stretching longer over the carpet as the sun dipped below the buildings. She picked up her phone, typed a message, deleted it, typed again, then blocked the number. What was left to say to a woman who'd never raised her voice and still taken everything? Back at the estate, Margaret sat on her back patio, rocking gently as cicadas hummed around the azaleas. Daniel brought her tea, kissed her forehead, then left without a word. She gazed into the distance, the warm breeze teasing the hem of her cardigan. The frame still sat in the study, but the real trophy wasn't glass or enamel. It was silence, respect, legacy. The late afternoon sun stretched long, golden rays across the estate's trimmed hedges and stone walkways, casting light on a scene that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Margaret Lewis moved slowly, but not weakly, across the lawn, every step measured, her spine upright, her silver hair pinned in a twist as precise as her legacy. Children's laughter spilled through the air like music, bouncing between the marble columns and garden fountains. Dozens of families wandered across the estate grounds, gathered for the charity garden gala she now hosted annually in her late husband's name. Crisp white tents flapped in the warm Dallas breeze, and a jazz quartet played soft renditions near the reflecting pool. Margaret walked past the donation table, nodding politely as someone handed her a wrapped bouquet. Her free hand ran across the top of a brass plaque freshly installed at the edge of the garden path. The Lewis Foundation for Community Dignity, founded 2025, in honor of resilience. She smiled faintly, the way one does at a well-earned memory. The deed to the estate, once expected to be Vanessa's crowning jewel, was now legally under the foundation's ownership, a trust written so tightly even Clara joked a ghost couldn't get through it. The house was no longer just a home. It was a symbol, a monument to survival wrapped in hydrangeas and vintage stone. Behind Margaret, the large French doors opened with a soft click. Clara stepped out, dressed elegantly in navy silk, a champagne flute in each hand. "You always did know how to make an ending look like a debutante ball," she said, handing one glass over. Margaret took it and clinked gently. "To endurance and polish," Clara smiled. "Vanessa's name hasn't crossed a single guest list in 6 months." "Not even whispered?" Margaret asked with a smirk. "Oh, whispered plenty," Clara replied, eyes twinkling, "but only in the past tense. They watched the children play, some barefoot in the grass, some sneaking pastries off trays. The estate once ruled by tension and silent rivalry now bloomed with warmth and noise. No eyes rolled, no teeth gritted, no smirks veiled in sweetness." Margaret's gaze fell on the framed photo display near the welcome table. Her late husband in his army blues, Daniel as a toddler in overalls, and one photo added just last week, a snapshot of her holding her grandson during last month's planning brunch. Daniel had come around, slowly but surely. The separation from Vanessa had been quiet, without dramatic announcements, but the shift was obvious. Fewer arguments, more phone calls, an apology that didn't use the word sorry, but came wrapped in respect. "You did right by him," Clara said, as if reading her thoughts. "I didn't do it for him," Margaret replied, eyes steady on the horizon. "But I'm glad he noticed." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees and lifting the hem of Margaret's floral shawl. Inside the study, now converted into the Foundation's planning office, a familiar case rested on a high, shelf-a-glass box. Inside it, one pink plastic dental plate. Vanessa's final humiliation had never needed to be explained. It had simply existed, framed, preserved. A relic of arrogance, silenced by foresight. "Are you ever going to take that thing down?" Clara asked, watching Margaret's eyes drift toward the window. Margaret took a small sip of champagne and let the moment breathe. "No," she said finally. "Some trophies aren't for display. They're for warning." They stood together for a moment longer, watching as another round of guests arrived, their voices light, their smiles real. The estate now buzzed with life, not because of who had been pushed out, but because of who had finally stepped forward. She thought about the years she'd spent biting her tongue, about every insult swallowed, every laugh endured, every moment Vanessa believed she had won. And then Margaret smiled, the kind of smile you earn, not wear. "They thought age made me weak," she murmured to herself, raising her glass toward the sunset. "But power, my dear, is ageless."